The chamber had been silent for 11 minutes before Ambassador Veth finally spoke, and even then her words came out quietly, too quietly for something that would later be described in 17 different languages as the moment the galaxy held its breath. They said no. She did not elaborate. She did not need to. The silence that followed her statement stretched across the council floor like something physical, like a material thing pressing down on the assembled representatives of 41 civilizations. The Dravathi delegate, a being whose species had not experienced genuine surprise in recorded memory, whose neurological architecture had evolved beyond the capacity for unexpected reaction, went completely, catastrophically still. Nobody moved. Nobody asked her to repeat herself. Because the word no had not been spoken in the Grand Council chamber in a very long time, and something in the quality of Ambassador Veth's silence suggested she herself did not fully understand what she had just reported. What nobody in that chamber understood yet, what would take months to fully comprehend and years to stop fearing, was that humanity had not simply refused. They had asked a question in return, and the question was still unanswered. 3 months earlier, the Council's motion had seemed straightforward. More than straightforward, it had seemed generous. The Galactic Compact's disarmament framework had been applied to 11 newly integrated civilizations over the course of 4 centuries, and it had worked every time. The logic was elegant. The mathematics were impeccable. A new species joining galactic civilization did not need weapons. The Compact provided protection. The Compact provided stability. The weapons, therefore, became redundant, and redundant weapons were dangerous weapons because they invited fear, and fear invited conflict, and conflict was precisely the thing the Compact existed to prevent. It was compassionate, the Council liked to say. It was rational. The vote was 40-1. The one dissenting vote came from the Skithrani delegation, and the Skithrani had dissented on every vote for the past century on the basis of philosophical objection to majority consensus, which everyone had long since stopped taking seriously. Ambassador Veth had been assigned to deliver the resolution to the human government because she was considered, by every measurable metric, the finest diplomatic mind in council service. She had integrated 6 species. She had negotiated the Pelhari Accords. She had personally convinced the Dravathi to accept written language as a legitimate form of communication, which had taken 9 years and had been described by her colleagues as an achievement on par with stellar engineering. She had studied humans for 2 years before the meeting. She had read everything the Compact's xenological archives contained about them. She had interviewed the 3 non-human researchers who had spent time on the human homeworld and who all agreed, despite slightly different emphases, that humans were a fascinating, emotionally complex, occasionally alarming species who were, at their core, practical, pragmatic. They understood power. They would negotiate. They might demand concessions, symbolic ones, probably, but they would understand that the Compact's protection was simply better than anything they could provide for themselves. All of this was the truth, and none of it mattered. The meeting had lasted 4 hours. 4 hours and 17 minutes to be precise, because Veth had logged every second afterward in her report to the Council, and she had done so with the compulsive thoroughness of someone trying to understand where she had miscalculated. The humans had been polite. That was the first thing. They had been genuinely, warmly, almost disarmingly polite, offering Veth refreshments she could not metabolize, asking questions about her journey, expressing what seemed to be sincere appreciation for her presence. The human diplomat assigned to meet her, a woman named Sira Callahan, had laughed at something Veth said in her opening remarks, a small laugh, real and unperformed, and for a moment Veth had thought this would be easier than expected. Then she had presented the resolution. Callahan had read it. All of it, with the focused, unhurried attention of someone reading something important for the first time, not for someone who wanted to seem attentive. She had asked several clarifying questions, questions that were, Veth noted in her report, remarkably precise. Not the questions of someone stalling. The questions of someone who already understood the general shape of what they were being told and needed to confirm the specific edges. Then Callahan had sat back, folded her hands. and said something that Veth had not been able to fully parse until she had played the recording back 7 times. She had said, "I need to ask you something first," and then she had asked it. Veth had not answered, not because she didn't want to, not because the question was hostile. She hadn't answered because she genuinely did not know, and in 4 centuries of diplomatic service, she had never been in a room where the correct answer was "I don't know," and she had no protocol for it. The council spent the next 6 weeks arguing about the question itself, not about humanity's refusal. That was simply a procedural obstacle, a complication to be managed. What generated 11 separate emergency sessions? What kept the council's senior analysts working through what passed for nights in the rotating station's artificial schedule was the content of the question. It had seemed simple at first. That was the problem. It had seemed like a political gambit, a rhetorical deflection, the kind of thing a young, nervous civilization might deploy to buy time. Some of the delegates had laughed when Veth reported it. The Dravathi had made a sound that translated loosely as predictable, but the human xenological team, the small group of alien researchers who had spent time on Earth, had gone very quiet. And xenologist Prow 7, who had lived among humans for 3 years and who was known for his meticulous emotional detachment, had requested a private meeting with the Council's security directorate the same day the question was reported. Nobody outside that meeting was told what was discussed. What filtered out, in fragments, through the particular quality of silence that senior officials project when they are trying not to project anything, was that the question was not rhetorical. It was not a delaying tactic. It was not political theater. The humans had asked it because they needed the answer, because their decision, their entire posture regarding integration into the compact, depended on it. The question was, who protects us if you decide we're no longer worth protecting? Ambassador Veth requested a second meeting. The council approved it after 3 weeks of deliberation, which was, by compact standards, extremely fast, an indication, though nobody said so explicitly, of a low-level collective anxiety that was beginning to take root in the chamber's architecture. She brought additional staff this time, a legal team, a xenological consultant who specialized in what the compact's documentation euphemistically called resistant integration scenarios. And at the Security Directorate's quiet insistence, an observer from the compact's Strategic Assessment Bureau, a division that officially concerned itself with infrastructure vulnerability and resource allocation, and that everyone in the relevant circles understood to be something considerably more than that. The observer's name was Vel Harach. He did not speak at the meeting. He sat in the back of the room and took notes on a device Veth didn't recognize, and he watched the humans with the specific quality of attention that she had only ever seen directed at things that frightened people. Callahan was there again. She had brought 2 people with her this time, a man named Tors, who said very little but listened with an intensity that Veth found difficult to look at directly, and an older woman whose name Veth never caught, who seemed to be there primarily to watch Vel Harach watching everyone else. Veth presented the council's response to the question. It had been carefully constructed. It was, she believed, genuinely reassuring, not in the performative sense but substantively. The compact's protection framework was explained in detail. 17 centuries of precedent were cited. The specific legal mechanisms that made unilateral withdrawal of protection effectively impossible were laid out with what Veth considered admirable clarity. Callahan listened, asked 3 more questions, and then said something that would eventually become known in the Council's classified archive, in the academic papers that were written about this period much later, in the nighttime thoughts of 41 species worth of senior officials who could not stop returning to it as the second question. It was not a question about law. It was not a question about precedent. It was, on its surface, almost absurdly simple. She had asked, "What's the longest any protected species has gone without needing protection?" The answer, which Veth's legal team provided after a 12-second consultation with their archives, was 430 years. The Pelhari, who had disarmed peacefully and had never faced a meaningful external threat during their period under compact protection. Callahan had nodded, as if she'd expected that number, as if it confirmed something. And then she had said, very quietly, almost to herself, 430 years. The way she said it, the particular weight she gave the words, made the legal team go still, made Veth's xenological consultant write something in his notes and then cross it out, made Vel Harach in the back of the room stop writing entirely. Tors, the quiet man, had looked at Callahan with an expression that Veth's later analysis identified as recognition. Not surprise. Recognition. As if they had discussed this number before. As if this was the number they had been waiting to hear confirmed. The Council's intelligence assessment, delivered 6 weeks after the second meeting, contained a section that had been redacted from the public summary, but that was slowly, quietly, becoming the most discussed document in the Compact's restricted information network. It concerned what the assessment termed humanity's historical relationship with continuity. What the analysts had found, or rather, what they had found and then spent 3 weeks trying to explain away before accepting, was that humans had a specific and unusual response to existential timescales. The xenological literature had noted it in passing. Humans lived short lives and knew it, which created a particular kind of psychological relationship with time. But the analysts had taken that observation and extended it into domains that the xenological literature had not examined. Humans, the assessment noted, had ended civilizations before. Not by accident, not through catastrophic failure. Their own civilizations, states, empires, systems of governance and culture that had accumulated over centuries, had been deliberately destroyed, restructured, or allowed to collapse and then rebuilt. Repeatedly. They had a documented pattern spanning the entirety of their recorded history of creating things and then watching them fail and then creating something else in the ruins. This would not have been remarkable. Extinction-level civilizational collapses were, depressingly, a common feature of early-stage species development. What was remarkable was the attitude the humans had developed toward this pattern. They appeared, the assessment concluded with a discomfort visible even in the prose, to have made peace with it, more than made peace with it. They had developed philosophy around it. Literature. A category of cultural expression specifically dedicated to processing loss at civilizational scale and continuing anyway. The analyst who wrote the section had appended a note. This is not the behavior of a species that fears institutional death. This is the behavior of a species that has practiced it. The assessment did not draw explicit conclusions from this. It didn't need to. Vel Harach read it in his office on the station's upper ring, and he sat with it for a long time, and then he sent a single-line communication to a colleague in the Strategic Assessment Bureau. The line read, "They weren't asking about protection. They were asking about what comes after. The third meeting was not requested by the Compact. It was requested by the humans. This was unprecedented." In the entire 4-century history of the disarmament framework, no species had ever initiated contact after the framework had been presented. They either complied, negotiated, or, in 2 cases that were classified above most clearance levels, did something that resulted in extended compact intervention. They did not send their own delegation to the compact station and request access to the council floor. They sent Callahan and Tors and the older woman whose name Veth had never caught, who was introduced this time as Dr. Myra Osai, and whose title was given as Historical Systems Analyst, which was not a designation that existed anywhere in the Compact's documentation of human governmental structures. The council convened in full session, 41 delegations, standing room only in the observer galleries, which had not happened in living memory for most of the species present. The humans were given the floor. Callahan stood up. She was a small person by human standards, and she looked, Veth would describe this later, struggling for accurate language, tired. Not physically exhausted, tired in a way that suggested she had been carrying something heavy for a very long time, and the weight had become so familiar that it was part of her posture now. She said, "We have a counter-proposal." The chamber's atmosphere changed at the word. Something that had been alert became watchful. Something that had been watchful became still. She said, "We will disarm. Completely. Every weapon system, every military infrastructure, every piece of technology with offensive capacity beyond what's required for civil order. We will disarm further than the resolution requires. We will do it within 5 years, and we will submit to full compact verification at every stage." She paused. The chamber did not move. She said, "In exchange, we want access to the Council's full historical archive. Every record of every species that has ever requested compact protection, every record of what happened to them, including the classified records. The silence that followed was different from the silence at the beginning. That silence had been surprise. This silence was something else. It had a texture, a weight. The Dravathi delegate, who had not visibly reacted to anything in the previous sessions, made a sound that Vel Harach, watching from his observer position, would later describe as the closest approximation of alarm he had ever heard from a species that had evolved past alarm. The reason the Dravathi reacted, the reason the sound moved through the chamber like a current, was not the request itself. Classified archives were sensitive, but requests for archive access were not uncommon. Species wanted to understand the compact. That was normal. It was the specificity of the request, every record of what happened to them, not to understand the compact, to understand what happened to species after they gave up their weapons, to understand the long arc, to understand the 430-year gap and what it meant, and what came before and after, and whether the Pelhari's peace was the rule or the anomaly. They were not asking about protection. They had never been asking about protection. They were auditing the compact's track record over civilizational timescales, and they had apparently been doing so since before the first meeting. Dr. Ose, the historical systems analyst, had not spoken yet. She was watching the chamber's reaction with an expression that Veth could not interpret at all. It was not smug. It was not satisfied. It was the expression of someone watching a result arrive that they had calculated in advance. Not pleasure, not triumph, but a kind of careful, exhausted recognition. Tors leaned over and said something to her very quietly. She nodded. And Veth, who was 2 seats away and whose species had exceptional auditory processing, caught 4 words. Tors had said, "The math checks out." Vel Harach submitted his full assessment to the Strategic Bureau 3 days after the 3rd meeting. The assessment was classified at a level that excluded most of the Council. It was also, within 2 weeks, the most discussed document in the Compact's restricted information network, not because it had been leaked, but because 17 separate senior officials had requested access simultaneously, which was itself an event without precedent, and which made the fact of the assessment's existence effectively public even if its contents were not. What was known about the assessment, through inference and the particular quality of silence that had descended on the Bureau's senior staff, was that it had changed Vel Harach's opinion of humanity significantly. And Vel Harach was not a person whose opinions changed. What was not known was what, specifically, had changed it. There were 3 theories circulating in the restricted channels. The first was that the human's request had revealed a level of strategic sophistication that the Council had not anticipated, that they had been analyzing the compact from the outside for years, had identified specific vulnerabilities in its protective framework, and had structured their counterproposal to exploit those vulnerabilities in a way that was technically within the rules. This theory was popular among the delegates who found it most reassuring, because it implied the humans were clever but comprehensible. The second theory was darker. It suggested that the humans' question, "Who protects us if you decide we're no longer worth protecting?" was not actually about the compact's legal framework at all, that it was about something the classified archives contained. That they already knew somehow, that the archives contained something the compact would not want them to see, and they were offering disarmament as leverage to get access to it. The third theory was the one nobody said out loud. It came from xenologist Prouse 7, who had lived among humans for 3 years, and who had requested that private meeting with the Security Directorate on the day the first question was reported. Prowl 7 had spent considerable time in human historical archives before his fieldwork, and he had come away from that research with observations that he described, in a paper that had been very quietly restricted from the public xenological database, as profoundly clarifying and deeply unsettling. Prowl 7's theory, insofar as it could be reconstructed from fragments, was that the humans were not negotiating at all, that what looked like negotiation was something else, that they had processed the compact's offer through a framework that had nothing to do with power dynamics or legal leverage, and that their counterproposal was genuine. They genuinely would disarm completely, but that the archive access was not a political demand. It was a research question. They wanted to know what happened to the others because they were planning for the possibility that it would happen to them, not planning to prevent it, planning for after. Planning for what came next in the ruins the way they had always planned for what came next in the ruins. They were, Prowl 7 had written in the restricted paper, the only species he had encountered that appeared to have developed contingency planning for its own extinction, not survival plans, contingency plans. The distinction, he had argued, mattered enormously. Veth requested a private meeting with Callahan, not an official session, not a council proceeding, a conversation. She framed it as a personal request, diplomat to diplomat, and to her considerable surprise, Callahan agreed immediately. They met in a small room off one of the station's secondary corridors, a room used for informal delegation gatherings, furnished with approximations of comfort that served none of the present species particularly well. Veth brought nothing. Callahan brought tours, which Veth had half expected, and also brought tea, which she had not expected at all, a human preparation, carried in an insulated container that Callahan had clearly brought from their ship because the station did not stock it. She offered a cup to Veth. Veth accepted. She could not metabolize it, but she held the warm container, and something about the gesture, the casual, unperformed generosity of it, settled something in Veth's chest that had been unsettled for months. She asked Callahan what she actually wanted, not from the compact, not from the council, what she wanted. Callahan was quiet for a long time. Tors beside her watched his tea. Then Callahan said, "I want my kids to be alive in 400 years. Obviously, I know I won't be. But I want whatever is alive in 400 years that came from us to still be us. You understand the difference?" Veth said she thought she did. Callahan said, "Your archive has records of 11 species that disarmed under the framework. We've been able to verify the existence of 9 of those species in current records. 2 of them we can't find. We've been looking for 6 months. They're not in the public database. They're not in the census. They were there and then they weren't, and the compact is still here and nobody seems to notice, or nobody seems to care, or she stopped. Started again. We're not accusing anyone of anything. I want to be clear about that. The compact might have perfectly good explanations for both of them. They might have renamed themselves. They might have integrated to the point of non-distinction. There might be paperwork errors spanning centuries. I genuinely do not know, and I am genuinely trying to stay open to every possibility." She looked at Veth. "But I can't disarm without knowing. You understand that? I cannot ask my species to give up the only thing standing between us and whatever we don't know yet, without understanding what happened to the ones who gave it up before us." Veth understood. She also understood, sitting in that small room with cooling tea she couldn't drink, that she had made an error. Not a diplomatic error, a fundamental one. She had come to the first meeting prepared to reassure humanity. She had prepared for skepticism, for political posturing, for demands about sovereignty and pride, and all the surface-level concerns that newly integrated species reliably produced. She had not prepared for what Callahan was actually expressing, which was not fear. It was something so much older and quieter than fear that it didn't have a good translation in the compact's diplomatic vocabulary. The closest she could find, working through the syntax of 3 different language families, was something like, "The careful grief of people who know what loss costs and who are trying to prevent it from happening again." They had been here before. Not here, not in this room, not in this conversation, but here, in the position of being asked to trust an institution larger than themselves with the safety of everyone they loved. They had been here as a species many times, and sometimes it had worked. And sometimes the archives suggested with their silences and their gaps and their two missing names, it had not. And they remembered. That was the thing Veth had not understood until that moment, sitting across from a tired woman holding tea in a room that fit neither of them. They remembered. Not perfectly, not completely, not without distortion, but they had been keeping records for thousands of years specifically because they had learned, in the long and brutal school of their own history, that things which were not recorded did not survive. They wrote down the failures. They wrote down the disasters. They built entire disciplines of study around understanding what had gone wrong and why, because the alternative was repeating it. 41 civilizations sat on the council, and not one of them had thought to check whether the humans had already researched the two missing species. Not one of them had thought to ask what a species that had spent its entire history recovering from catastrophe might think to look for when offered institutional protection. Not one of them had understood that the question who protects us if you decide we're no longer worth protecting was not a negotiating tactic. It was institutional memory. Speaking. The classified archive review took 4 months. The council granted access, not unanimously. There were dissenting votes, and the debates that preceded the decision were, by accounts from everyone who witnessed them, unlike any debates the chamber had previously hosted. Not because of their technical content, because of their emotional texture. Because somewhere around the 3rd week of deliberation, the delegates had stopped arguing about legal precedent and started asking each other questions that nobody had planned to ask. Questions like, why don't we know what happened to them? Dr. Os led the human research team. Tors managed the logistics. Callahan was present for some sessions and absent for others, and Veth noticed that when she was absent, Tors had the expression of someone who is managing too many things simultaneously and has been doing so for a long time. The review produced a report. The report was not the kind of document that was summarized efficiently. It was the kind of document that people read and then sat with, alone, for a while. The two missing species were not missing in the way the humans had feared. They were not gone. They had not been absorbed or eliminated or quietly ended by an institution that had grown indifferent. They had done something more complicated and in some ways more disturbing and in some ways more comprehensible, depending on what framework you use to understand it. They had, under protection and over generations, changed. Not their biology, their institutions, their relationship to history. They had given up their weapons and been safe. And they had been safe for long enough that the part of their culture concerned with what came after danger had slowly, without anyone noticing, stopped producing anything. The language changed. The stories changed. The oral traditions and the archive practices and the particular forms of memorial that cultures develop when they have experienced enough loss to know they must record it, those changed, or stopped, or became ceremonial rather than functional. And when the compact's protective coverage had shifted, not withdrawn, not deliberately removed, but shifted, redistributed across changing threat landscapes in the way that institutional resources always shift, there had been a gap, a period of exposure. Brief, by civilizational standards, one species had survived it, barely. Changed enough that they were technically still present in the census, but were, as Osai put it in the report with the careful precision of someone who had thought for a long time about how to say something honest, not recoverable as themselves. They existed. They were not who they had been. The thread was broken. The other species had not survived the gap. The report did not conclude that the compact had done this deliberately. It did not conclude that the compact was predatory or negligent or malicious. It concluded something more uncomfortable than any of those things. It concluded that the compact's protective framework worked exactly as designed, and that the design had not accounted for what 400 years of safety did to a species' capacity to endure the end of safety. It concluded that the humans, who had spent their entire history cycling through catastrophe and recovery, who had never been safe for 400 years, who had built a civilization-wide immune system against institutional failure, specifically because their institutions had failed so many times, were probably the worst possible species to disarm. Not because they were dangerous, because they were survivors. Because the very history that made them sometimes frightening, sometimes chaotic, sometimes irrational by the compact's logical frameworks, the wars, the collapses, the brutal recurring pattern of building and losing and rebuilding, had given them something that the two missing species no longer had and that the compact had not understood was possible to lose. They had not forgotten what came after. Vel Harich met with Callahan alone near the end of the review process. He had requested it. She had again agreed. He told her what he had understood after the second meeting when Tors had said the math checks out. He said he had spent 3 months trying to find the error in his interpretation before accepting that there wasn't one. He said, "You were never going to disarm, not without the archives. And if the archives had shown you something worse than what they showed you, you wouldn't have disarmed then either." She didn't confirm or deny it. He said, "The counterproposal was real. I believe that. You would have disarmed if the math had worked out, but you modeled the scenario where it didn't work out and you had something ready for that too." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "We always model the scenario where it doesn't work out." He said, "I know, that's what's so." He stopped, started again. "The other species don't do that. They model success. Integrated, protected, long-term stable scenarios. They model what they're working toward. You modeled the failure mode." She looked at him, and in her expression was something he hadn't seen on any human face in all his months of study. Not strategy, not calculation, not pride. It was exhaustion so deep it had become structural. The exhaustion of a species that had been doing this for so long that it no longer felt like a choice. It simply was what they were, she said. "We've buried enough people that we know what happens if you stop thinking about what comes next. We learned that a long time ago." He said, "How long?" She said, "Before we started writing things down." The council did not vote on disarmament again. The resolution remained technically active in the procedural record, which was how compact governance worked. Nothing was ever formally withdrawn because the formal acknowledgement of failure was considered diplomatically inadvisable. But it was, in the specific language of institutional inertia, tabled indefinitely. No official statement was issued. No formal change in humanity's status was announced. The archive review was classified at a level that exceeded most of the delegates' clearance, which was itself unusual enough to generate 17 separate procedural objections, none of which were resolved before the following fiscal cycle. What did change, quietly without ceremony, documented only in the kind of administrative record that nobody reads until a historian finds it centuries later, was the compact's threat assessment category for humanity. Not upgraded, not downgraded. Changed, moved into a classification that had not previously been used for any integrated species. A classification previously reserved for phenomena, stellar events, resource cascades, uncontrolled ecological systems, things that were not aggressive, things that were not malicious, things that simply continued, regardless of what anything else in the system did. Vel Harich wrote the reclassification personally. He used 3 words for the classification category, which was 2 more than usual. He wrote persistent, adaptive, non-concluding. Callahan never saw the reclassification. If she had, she might have recognized it. She might have thought it was wrong in some way, or right in some way, or incomplete in the particular way that everything said about humanity from the outside always was. Or she might simply have nodded, the way she had nodded when Veth's legal team confirmed 430 years, with the expression of someone who had already done the calculation, who had already lived inside the number long enough to feel its weight, and who was already, quietly, carefully, thinking about what came next. The station's rotation continued. The stars outside the observation windows moved in their long arcs. And somewhere in the compact's classified archive, in a section that had not been opened in decades, 2 names sat in a silence that had meaning now. A meaning the council had not intended to create, and could not take back, and that 11 species worth of newly anxious senior officials were going to be thinking about for a very long time. Not because the humans had threatened anyone, not because they had revealed a weapon or demonstrated a capability or issued any form of ultimatum. but because they had asked a question, a small, specific, precise question about time and about what happens at its end. And in asking it, they had revealed something about themselves that was more unsettling than any weapon the Compact had ever catalogued. They had revealed that they had asked it before, that they had been asking it in one form or another for as long as they had been asking anything at all, that the question was not new, that the preparation behind it was not new, that they were not a young species encountering the galaxy's dangers for the first time, but an old one, old in a specific and terrible sense, old in the sense of having failed and continued so many times that continuing had become the architecture of who they were. The galaxy had been waiting for humanity to realize how small it was. What it had not been prepared for was the possibility that humanity already knew, and had already decided that knowing didn't change anything. That was the answer that had shaken the stars. Not a refusal, not a threat, not a display of power, just two words in a quiet room to a xenologist who had asked how long, before writing, before records, before the careful archiving of disasters that had seemed to the Compact's researchers like the beginning of human civilization. Before all of that already, they had been practicing this, already learning the shape of catastrophe, already developing the habit of continuing anyway, already becoming in the slow, terrible school of their own survival exactly what they were now, a species that had never stopped being afraid and had never let the fear stop them, a species for whom danger was not a problem to be solved but a condition to be endured, and endured and endured and endured, until endurance itself became indistinguishable from existence. The Council would spend years trying to find the right word for it. They never would. There wasn't one. Not in any of the 41 languages spoken in the chamber, not in any of the 17 more spoken in the observer galleries, not in the Compact's vast diplomatic vocabulary, built over centuries to contain every nuance of every experience in known civilization. Because what the humans were, specifically, was a thing that the rest of the galaxy had never had to become. They were the ones who had kept going.